Hi, I'm Dr. David Purves. In this film, I'm talking about how to overcome fear. But first, let's think a little bit about how fear comes to dominate your life. Fear is perhaps the most powerful emotion that we can experience. And fear arises when we perceive a threat to our survival. But there's a paradox with fear. Whilst fear is a horrible experience and it's just completely disrupting, it's also extremely useful because fear tells you when you need to do something. Now, historically, of course, we've used fear to help us to stay alive in threatening situations. But in modern life, we just don't have those threatening situations to nearly the extent that we used to do when we were living on the Serengeti or on plains and having to fight for survival. In the modern world, threats to survival are not normally about physical survival. Threats to survival are about the survival of your sense of personal value. In a sense, threats to your self-esteem. But whether it's a threat to your self-esteem or whether it's a threat to your personal value, it's the same fear system which is evoked. And that's the problem. The same fear system that tells you you've got to run away and fight for survival is not appropriate if you feel that there is a threat to your self-esteem or a threat to your self-value. These days, the most common fears that people would experience are things like fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of being found out as a fraud, fear of being seen as not good enough, fear of being perceived or seen as different, as other, as not part of the group in which you live. These fears are not fears to your survival, but they are perceived as fears, as threats to your sense of personal value. How do you cope with fear? Well, as a practicing psychologist and CBT therapist, I see at first hand many of the very interesting and useful ways that people try to cope with fear. One of the most common ones that I see is to try to do things perfectly. People often would claim to be perfectionists. And of course, if you fear rejection or you fear failure or you fear not being seen as good enough, one strategy that you can use is to try to do things perfectly. If you do things perfectly, of course, then you will not be criticized. The problem with this strategy, of course, is that you can't do things perfectly. There isn't a perfect solution. And the trouble is that when people use the perfectionist strategy, they become so competent and they become so helpful, useful and effective that they get burdened with more and more things to do that they try to do perfectly, often leading to a point where you just can't take anymore. It's the straw that broke the camel back syndrome. So perfectionism, whilst it is a strategy that people use, is not a very good strategy for overcoming fear. Another strategy which is very commonly used is avoidance. You would typically avoid the things that you're frightened of, that you're fearful of. The trouble with that is, when you avoid the things that you're fearful of, you never have an opportunity to learn that they're not as bad as you thought they would be. When I say to people, well, you did that. Was it as bad as you predicted it would be? Was it as bad as you thought it would be? It never is. But if you use avoidance as a strategy, you never have an opportunity to learn new information, to update your fear files. Living with fear isn't normal and you don't need to do it. And you certainly don't need to have the anxiety that goes along with the fear to spoil the experiences in your life. Furthermore, it's likely to be the case that the strategies you're using to manage the fear and the anxiety are probably causing more problems than they're solving. So let me offer you 3 strategies for overcoming fear. The first one is to recognize your competence. If you struggle with fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of being found out, fear of being seen as a fraud, you're unlikely to be recognizing and owning your personal competence. Now, I never met an anxious person who wasn't highly competent and actually highly efficient and effective, but yet questioned their competence, questioned their efficiency and their effectiveness. So the first strategy I suggest is learning to own your competence. Now you might say, well, you're mad, I can't possibly think that I'm competent. But I usually describe it like this. I say, how tall are you? 5'10". Okay. If you're 5'10", you may as well believe you're 5'10". There's no value in life in believing you're 5'6" or 6'2". You have to believe you are the height you are, otherwise you're going to end up buying clothes which are too big or too small for no obviously good reason. If you're competent, at least own your competence. People will tell you you're competent, people will give you feedback, allow it in and own your competence. The second strategy which I recommend is to stop avoiding the things which you're fearful of. Fear and avoidance go together hand in glove. When you avoid things, of course, you deny yourself the opportunity to learn that they're not as bad as the fear makes you believe that they are. So when you push yourself a little bit to do the things which you would normally avoid, you're allowing your system, your brain, to update its files and to recognize that actually, you know what, you can cope better than you thought you would, and it's not that bad anyway. The third strategy that I recommend is to use a system such as mood control, which will give you a structured program, a map and a journey to go from fear to happiness, joy, and a good, satisfying experience. Now, the reason I recommend a structured program is that fear is a journey, and fear takes you on a journey that you don't want to be on. It's a spoiled journey, it's an uncomfortable journey, and it's a never-ending journey. Unless you challenge the basic fear structures, they will not go away by themselves, because there's no reason why they would. There's no reason for a habit to extinguish itself. A habit will continue until you do something active and proactive even to extinguish the habit. And that's why I recommend a program of cognitive behavior therapy such as mood control. Mood control's 13 weeks, but then you can carry on with it, and it will take you from where you are to where you want to get to, and it will quite effectively extinguish the habit of fear and allow you to develop new habits of happiness, satisfaction, and joy. And why not? Even if you don't use mood control, you need to use a structured cognitive behavior therapy program to get on a new journey and to delete the old journey of fear. I hope you found this information interesting and potentially useful. Thanks for taking the time to watch and listen. My name is Dr. David Purves, and I hope to see you in a future film.